I'm delighted to be here and to be part of this and to share some of these thoughts about the ballerina with about beauty in the ballerina with this audience. Beauty may be in the eye of the beholder, but it changes over time, and it means different things across the vast range of human culture. The same can be said of the ballerina, an icon of desire and a fetish of femininity. She exists in multiple forms, and like fashion, which she often exemplifies but also eludes, she keeps changing. Although people have always danced, ballet is a relatively young art. Its origins lie in the courts of Renaissance Italy and in the France of Louis XIV, where the practice acquired both a name and a nomenclature. The ballerina, however, was slower to emerge. Only in the 18th century did she claim the spotlight, and it took another 100 years for her to acquire the point shoes and tutu that became the distinctive badges of her identity. I'm just having a little question about, sorry, we're having a little technical moment. I just want to know which one is it this one over here that I pressed to move forward? Yes, it is. Okay. It wasn't a big technical snafu. Of course, we glimpse qualities associated with the ballerina long before that iconic moment. Nefertiti's swan-like neck and proud carriage of the head, exemplified by this sculpture from ancient Egypt. The plunging backbend of this dancing Maenad from Paestum. The three graces, the lightness, harmony, and youth of the three graces in Botticelli's painting La Primavera. The gestural vividness and physical boldness of Filippo Lippi's red-slippered Salome. Sorry, I have two computers here and I'm using paper. Filippo Lippi's red-slippered Salome dancing for Herod in exchange for the head of John the Baptist. I love these Renaissance dancers. True, they were the made-up images of painters conjured from the imagination, not pictures of real people dancing, but they were always moving, tripping lightly, unburdened by layers of clothing and social convention. In the dance treatises of the Renaissance, by contrast, the images of real dancing women were rigid and static. Encased in farthingales and iron corsets, with sleeves to the hands and ruffs to the chin, these high-born ladies were prisoners of fashion. Here from Fabrizio Caroso's late 16th century treatise Il Ballerino are a few of his marchesas and principessas performing a stately pavane or the sedate stepping dance known as the bassa, every last one of them dressed to kill. No wonder the painters favored diaphanous fabrics and looped-up overskirts, imagining the moving body beneath the layers of Renaissance clothing. No wonder, too, that engravers preferred women who stepped lively and displayed a bit of attitude. With all that court stuff, who could move? Could any of those principessas even sense their own bodies? An early ballerina to seize the public imagination was the Paris opera star Marie Camargo. Born in 1710, she shortened her skirts to a few inches above the ankle. She may or she may not have been the first, the better to display the sparkle of her petit allegro. Conservatives were incensed at the sight of so much flesh. The fact that she lived openly as the mistress of the Comte de Clermont only added fuel to the fire. But ankles weren't all she bared. Her plunging décolletage displayed her neck and shoulders with much of her bosom. Her ballerina rival, Marie Salé, who was also a choreographer, was equally daring. She tossed off the mask that dancers had worn for over a century and donned body-skimming dresses that celebrated the sensuousness of her figure. A chanson of the time referred to her arms as amiable seducers. Jean-Georges Nouvert, the choreographer whose theories of the new action ballet were partly inspired by her, much preferred what he called her nobility and harmonious simplicity, and her tender, voluptuous, but always modest movements to Camargo's technical brilliance. He obviously responded to her expressiveness, her ability to quicken the heart and speak to the soul. Like Camargo, albeit in a very different way, she was unique. Now, ballerinas may have taken center stage, but they often had to share it with men such as Gaëtan Vestris, who once declared, "There are only 3 men in Europe, the King of Prussia, Monsieur de Voltaire, and me." Obviously, he did not have a problem of self-esteem. This changed dramatically with the advent of Romanticism. The movement swept full-blown onto the stage of the Paris Opera in 1832 with the premiere of La Sylphide. The ballet starred Marie Taglioni, the prototypical romantic ballerina, and introduced the Ballet Blanc, or the so-called white ballet. Both were radically new, a vision of enchanted sisterhood and ethereal femininity. In the Ballet Blanc, the hero glimpsed his unattainable love among white or pastel-skirted willies, naiads, sylphs, naiads, and other mysterious creatures. Now, this, by the way, is Carlotta Grisi, the first Giselle. Now, Taglioni was not the first ballerina to dance on point. However, it was only in La Sylphide that this relatively new technique acquired a metaphysical dimension and became uniquely an expression of the eternal feminine. When a dancer rises on her points, the Russian émigré critic Andrei Levinson wrote in the 1920s, she breaks away from the exigencies of everyday life and enters into an enchanted country, that she may thereby lose herself in the ideal. One glimpses that enchanted country in lithographs of the era. Romantic prints varied in subject matter, but they belonged above all to the ballerina. Often she was shown in flight, eluding the arms of a lover. Or she might stand demurely on a scallop shell, tantalizing in her nearness. Or she could be swimming. She was a creature of the air and a daughter of nature, who made her home in secluded valleys, misty lakesides, secret glades, and wild heaths. If you know La Sylphide or Giselle, it's all there. The Romantic era dramatically transformed the relationship of ballet and gender. With her pointe shoes and tutu, the ballerina became a kind of Freudian fetish, while ballet itself became increasingly an art identified with the feminine. Not only did women dominate the romantic ballet in numbers, they also dominated its subject matter. For French critics such as Théophile Gautier, ballet was above all a display of femininity, an art glorifying beauty as embodied in the ballerina. "If any woman is required to be beautiful," he wrote, "it must surely be the dancer." He personally didn't care for what he called Taglioni's ethereal, virginal grace. He preferred, instead, the pagan charms, pagan is his word, of the Austrian ballerina Fanny Elsler, famed for her performance of Spanish dances. And this print is actually called the Three Graces, and as you see, that's Taglioni in the middle wearing a dress that is virtually identical to a dress, the real dress that's displayed downstairs in the show, which is very exciting. She recalls the muse Terpsichore, Gautier wrote, with her tambourine and her tunic slit to reveal her thigh and caught up with clasps of gold. When she fearlessly arches back, throwing her voluptuous arms behind her, she evokes a vision of those beautiful figures from Herculaneum or Pompeii, or one might add even Paestum, like the one we saw before. For Gautier, nothing was more alien to the romantic ballet than real men. "You know what a hideous sight an ordinary male dancer is," he wrote. A great awkward creature with a long red neck swelling with muscles, thick calves, the airs of Adonis and Apollo, and the pirouette and other gestures of mechanical puppets, end quote. He much preferred travesty dancers, women who donned the garb of princes, sailors, soldiers or lovers, and made men increasingly redundant, turning the stage into an all-female seraglio. The Romantic era tutu ended at mid-calf. As the 19th century wore on, it grew shorter and puffier, adding the layers of tulle that became a fire hazard on the crowded gaslit stages of the 1860s and 1870s. And if any of you have ever done a little bit of newspaper research during that period, it's astonishing the number of stories about ballet girls and fire. And we laugh, but I wouldn't have wanted to be one of those ballet girls on fire. New ballerinas came to the fore, famed for their strength, precision, and bravura. They were both Victorian fantasy objects and virtuoso machines. They had sturdy legs and well-fleshed bodies with ever-expanding skirts over safely hidden hips and buttocks. Here, flanking Claudina Cucchi as Giselle in the middle is Carlotta Brianza on the left, who was the first Aurora in The Sleeping Beauty, and on the right, Pierina Legnani, Petipa's first Odette Odile in Swan Lake. In Degas' paintings, the ballerina seems to emerge from a halo of tulle, her own and those of her sister dancers, the outline of her limbs visible through the diaphanous fabric. By the century's end, she had acquired the hourglass figure of an Edwardian temptress, hips flaring from a wasp waist and an ample bosom, exemplified by Virginia Zucchi in this painting by Georges Clairin. In February 1895, Figaro Illustré published a special issue about the Paris Opera. More than half the issue was given over to the opera's dancers. Black and white photographs showed children in class. Now, notice the lower photograph with the boys' class, there were all of 4 boys in the school. Obviously, male dancing was not valued in the 1890s in Paris. Color photographs, meanwhile, showcase the company's stars and rising talents in their dressing rooms or stretching in the foyer de danse, both off limits to the general public, though not to the opera's annual subscribers. There are mimes with sultry good looks and travesty dancers with a touch of attitude. But the core, even in an exotic divertisement such as this one for the opera Samson and Delilah, celebrated a collective image of girlishness. Sexual allure and sophisticated beauty were the province of the ballerina. The 20th century transformed the ballerina just as it transformed women's bodies. Corsets were abandoned, leaving the torso free to bend, stretch, and arch. Dancers associated with the modern movement led by Isadora Duncan donned tunics that invited accusations of nakedness and threw away their shoes. Here are a few of Abraham Wolkowitz's many watercolors of Duncan dancing. In Michel Fokines' works for the Ballet Russe, there was barely a tutu to be seen. He, too, dressed his ballerinas in tunics, while his choreography celebrated the curving line and dynamic energy, the dynamic energy that Léon Bakst revealed in his costume designs, and 2 of them are here. Fokines' dancers reveled in their newfound freedom. Tamara Karsavina and Anna Pavlova may not have been the greatest technicians of their day, but they were deeply expressive. The plasticity of their upper bodies told new stories and expanded 3-dimensionally into space. Their feet touched the ground and they shared their dreams with their audiences. And I'd like to point out that Pavlova, who's on the upper right, is actually wearing a pleated Fortuny dress. She had many, as did Isadora Duncan. And I would have loved to have seen one down in the exhibition. I was so hoping there'd be one. However, they never abandoned the tutu or point work. However, they infused them with the vague, elusive sensuousness prized by symbolists. Even as Giselle or The Dying Swan, the solo that Pavlova danced for audiences around the globe for nearly 20 years, they were modern ballerinas. Of course, the tutu didn't disappear. When it returned in the late 1920s, however, it looked decidedly modern, with new materials and skirts that revealed most of the leg. In La Chatte, Olga Svesitsova wore a tutu of semi-transparent mica, then a very new material. In The Prodigal Son, which is in the middle, Felia Dubrovska wore a skirt that barely covered her upper thighs. Her siren descendants at the New York City Ballet wear pretty much the same costume today. Alice Nikitina, as Flora, in a pseudo-mythological ballet, barely wore a skirt at all. It was only a short step to leotards and an ode, a 1928 ballet choreographed by Leonid Massine. The Balanchine look was born. In fact, in the 1930s, Massine was about the only choreographer in either ballet or modern dance who put his dancers, men as well as women, into leotards. Here, for instance, is Jeu d'enfant. This is the one on the right. Standing up is the top, alias Tamara Tumanova, and that was in 1932. On the left is Rouge et Noir from 1938, with Alicia Markova as the woman in a leotard, it said, painted by Matisse himself. How bodies had changed since the days of those sturdy Victorian primas. The 1920s and 1930s weren't only about ballerina legs or even about classical divas. The allure of a woman dancing alone was just as evident in the great Spanish dancer Antonia Merced, who called herself La Argentina, who donned the serpentine bata de cola of the flamenco dancer. Felia Dubrovska in the long Russian jumper dress known as the sarafan that she wore as the bride in Les Noces. Nina Verchinina, a ballet dancer who had studied with Mary Wigman, in the trouser dress that dramatized the expansiveness of her gestures in Les Présages. Or Martha Graham, who invented and even stitched her own costumes, as we've already heard, wearing the knitted jersey tubes that stretched like a second skin in Satiric Song and her signature solo, Lamentation. Or Sono Osato, the glamorous Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo dancer, who was the first Miss Turnstiles in On the Town. All these women cast a spell of personality and imagination. In 1948, after several failed companies, George Balanchine and Lincoln Kirstein teamed up yet again to form, this time, the New York City Ballet. From the first, the new company struggled to define itself graphically. How was it different from the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo, with which Balanchine had only recently been affiliated? What made it distinctive? The answer became apparent in the covers of the souvenir programs of the 1950s. The New York City Ballet was not about costume or scenery or painters, even though they were all in evidence during the company's early seasons. It was about feet and legs, unadorned and unapologetically balletic. In ultramodern ballets such as Agon and the Four Temperaments, it was also about sleek black leotards, neatly belted at the waist, worn with the cool of a runway model and the energy of an athlete. Now, I should explain, this photo is of Concerto Barocco. They're not in leotards, they're in another kind, sort of very short tunics, another kind of practice wear. And the interesting thing is that it is very dark and they were only shifted to white, which is what is now used in the 1960s. In large numbers, these B-girls, as Stravinsky called them, could seem anonymous. But as individuals, Balanchine's women exuded strong personalities. Maria Tallchief, vulnerable and proud. Tanaki Leclerc, with legs as witty as they were long. Allegra Kent, a flower child married to the Vogue photographer Bert Stern, who sometimes used her as a model for the magazine, and that's where I found these photographs. Kent, too, had limbs that went on forever, and a flexibility that made the most extreme positions seem natural. By the standards of the time, the Balanchine ballerina was thin. Hers was an active working body, powerful rather than decorative. Muscle gave it shape, but shape was going out of style. With the arrival of Twiggy in the mid-1960s, fashion said goodbye to curves. Ballet dancers followed suit. They became leaner and even longer and acquired the look of sophisticated nymphets. Quote, Balanchine amid his new breed is how Newsweek captioned this photo in 1969. And if you look closely, you can see Gelsey Kirkland on the extreme right, and then 3 in is a very, very young Merrill Ashley. And there are many others there who some of you would know. But a strong gale wasn't about to snap these dancers in two, as a fashion writer wrote about Twiggy's distinctive look. Like Merrill Ashley, by the 1970s, they were leading their art to new heights. When Suzanne Farrell returned to the New York City Ballet in the mid-1970s, she brought a European glamour with her, a sophisticated womanly presence. The decade marked the height of the dance boom, a golden age for ballerinas. Jet travel whisked them around the world, and everyone seemed to converge on New York. At ABT, there was Natalia Makarova, she's on the lower left, who defected from the Kirov Ballet in 1970, along with homegrown stars such as Cynthia Gregory, who's shown in her Black Swan costume, and Gelsey Kirkland. At Ailey, there was Judith Jameson, the choreographer's muse, and Sarah Yarborough, who had grown up in Haiti and trained at the School of American Ballet. Like many dancers of the 1970s, Jameson was tall, with legs that carved huge arcs through space, plangent and powerful. The ballerina, like the proverbial zebra, keeps changing her stripes. She belongs to her moment. Now that gyms have replaced dance studios as preferred recreational sites, she looks more than ever like an athlete, her body toned by years of cross-training, in addition to a growing number of hours spent in the studio. But she brings more to the stage than mere athletic prowess. In this 1996 photograph of Wendy Whalen with Peter Bohl in Opus 19, one senses the imaginative power that lies behind her simplest gesture, even as her muscled legs and turnout speak of technical mastery. This is the ballerina's secret, her ability to lead us into the secret chambers of her art, disclosing its beauty through physical action, lit by her imagination, and filtered through her own subjectivity. Thank you. Not one question, not one remark.
I have a remark, something that struck me very interesting. The photograph showed in the 19th century when you mentioned that costumes caught on fire. I noticed the two ballerinas, the two dancers, on the far left and the far right, they were on their toes. And what came to my mind was that at that period, what was the time of exposure of a photograph?
It wasn't an action photograph.
Yeah, so they were probably propped up on some kind of
They were resting against something because I think the time exposure at that point was like a minute. And
Yeah.
even though they had fabulous balance, remember one of them did the first Rosadagio, nevertheless, that's pushing it. And they had to sand it. So very often things would then be, one might say, airbrushed out.
So in other words, the photographs of that period they're not like slices of time
No.
of within dance, whereas in the 20th century, although in the 20th century oftentimes they posed, but still they were like slices of time. You could capture the dancers in movement.
It depends when. The earliest sort of action photographs that I know which captured movement are some of Nijinsky from about 1910, where he's shown jumping, or maybe 1909. But that was a real rarity. It's not really until the 1920s that you see performance photographs, that you see photographs where people are taken while dancers are obviously moving.
Hello? Oh, hi, here. Ms. Garafola?
Yes,
Hi, I'm on the side.
okay.
Do you think the image of the classical ballerina with the tutu and the tiara is fading away or is going to start fading away?
Well, I think there are many competing images and I think it also depends how much one knows about the field, where one is in the field, et cetera, et cetera. For instance, if one is working in a ballet company, obviously that's only part of the story. But consider, for little girls, consider that whole series of children's books, Angelina Ballerina. Consider all the stuff that is sold to girls, tutus and various other things. This remains an image that we have to deal with. Also consider, even at the New York City Ballet, which is a true repertory company, as we heard this morning, this is absolutely true, they spend at least 6 weeks every year doing at least one, if not two, performances a day of Nutcracker, whose culminating female image is the Sugar Plum Fairy in her tutu. So I think the tutu is something that remains even in a repertory company. As a historian, I probably spend a great deal more time talking about Balanchine's leotard ballets, to use that term, which is not entirely correct, than I do about all the ballets, one can say, in which he used tutus and which were performed in tutus. So I think it's not the only image, but I think it's a very crucial one, and it's one that has certainly held its own despite all the other contending images.
Thank you.
Hi, I want to know, I realize that Balanchine is responsible for the long limbs, but had that trend started before he really said this is how he wants his dancers to look?
Absolutely. It really starts, I think, in the 1920s, when the dancers begin to slim down. As you saw, I had a slide of 3 dancers. I said when the tutu comes back in the 20s, it looks more modern. Diaghilev would not put someone in a dress like that unless he felt that they had almost more like a flapper look. In other words, longer, slimmer legs and could show their legs. He only liked to see certain types of legs. But remember, this is where Balanchine does his earliest ballets. And so I think this is something that certainly predates the New York City Ballet, but it's certainly something that is allied, I would say, with fashion and with changes in what was considered the fashionable body. The 2 leotard dancers in leotards from the 1930s, the Massine, this predates the New York City Ballet from the 1930s, and as you see, those bodies are quite different from those of the stockier ballerinas. So I think there's always, as I said, there's a real connection between fashion and the ballerina, but that sometimes the ballerina eludes fashion. But sometimes she exemplifies it. or exemplifies changes that are taking place. I think one of the interesting things we heard this morning from Wendy Whalen is, how different she felt her body and the bodies of her fellow dancers were from the mannequins, from models, that they were not runway bodies. And speaking about the musculature and everything else, and what apart from the fact that the body needs to move and therefore the clothes have to be different and they have to have all their little secret things. But the ballerina herself does exemplify something, but also eludes it, I think.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
First, thank you very much. It was incredibly informative talk. You mentioned in the beginning about the male dancer, but only briefly. Do you think there is an evolution in the male image and the male dancer in the modern ballet, even comparing the New York City Ballet and ABT? And ABT, we have such a vast amplitude between Marcelo Gomez and Daniil Simkin, and New York City Ballet, where it's just the evolution of a male image and of the image of a male dancer through the costume. Can you a little touch up on that?
That's a whole other lecture, and I spent a great deal of time trying not to put men into this, and I didn't entirely succeed. Ailey's in there and a few others. There were, of course, enormous revolutions in the male thing, in the presentation of the male, especially in the early 20th century. Dramatic. Remember, the ballet stage of the 19th century was hugely feminized, was largely populated by women, and in the early 20th century, there's the first of a really major gender shift with the Ballet Russe, with figures such as Nijinsky, such as Massines, Adolphe Bohm, wonderful and diverse male images, and that continues into the, continues. There are different Soviet styles of dancing. There are many different things. But as I say, that's really a whole different image. This was about, for once, I wanted to talk about women.
Thank you very much.
I wondered if you could talk a little bit about race in ballet and the role of African American ballerinas.
Unfortunately, African American ballerinas have not had a tremendously active role in the history of ballet. There is a pervasive racism throughout the field. I'm not certain that I would say this is intended racism, but sometimes you can have unintended consequences for any number of reasons, and that's something. I'm delighted that the Dance Theater of Harlem is beginning again, because it gives, I believe, a goal to young girls that perhaps who may, instead of shifting over to study obsessively other forms during those crucial years of training, that they would then, actually still study obsessively ballet. So I just hope that Virginia Johnson will find the funding and the dancers to continue her project, because I feel it's enormously important. But it's also absolutely essential for any of us who have any connection with any organization to point out, in whatever ways we can, that there are ways of finding African American dancers. There are ways of finding and identifying African American critics. There are ways of identifying and finding African Americans who can be part of the ballet world. Yes.
I was delighted to see the photographs of Figaro, of the Paris Opera Ballet. I have a similar spread from 1990 with the ballerinas of the time, and that made me wonder if ballerinas were an actual inspiration for designers in Paris or in any other fashion center. Do you have any examples, or do you know of any? Of a ballerina being a muse to fashion design?
Being a muse to fashion designers. I would have to think about that, because right now that was not the project I set myself to do. Certainly in the 19th century, I think they worked more closely with people who did their distinctive wardrobes, as did many actresses. They didn't actually have the designer per se doesn't really enter the dance world until really the 20th century. I would say that Bakst, for instance, was inspired for some of his designs, his streetwear, by not so much by certain people who were not quite dancers, but more like the Marchesa Casati, and who were divas of some kind and exceptional personalities. I'm kind of running through my Rolodex of Diaghilev dancers, and I can't really think. The one who was the real inspiration was not a ballerina at all, but really Nijinsky. And I'm not so sure how much that was connected. He inspired fashion, although many of the illustrators who depicted him visually were connected with the fashion world in some way, such as Georges Barbier and others. But I'm not really quite. I'm not really. Well, I wouldn't call her a ballerina, but nevertheless, Rubinstein, although Rubinstein was usually not dressed by Bakst, even though she was dressed by him on stage for some of the time, and then in the 20s she often had her clothes made up by one of the Paris houses. I'm sorry? Yeah. But I thought we were talking about the other way, about a designer being inspired by a dancer, and that would be the sort of other way. Of course, I think there may have been connections with certain designers like Fortuny, but I think it was really more like Pavlova, who was a very fashion, became something of a fashion icon, as well as I would say Isadora Duncan, who had a lot of these Fortuny dresses. But I think there might have been some kind of thing. But I don't really know. Margot Fontaine had a very close relationship with Dior and then Saint Laurent. So there might have been something there.
One last question.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, my question is sort of along this line, because we know that life imitates art and vice versa. So I was going to ask a fashion question in regard to this. Was dancing on point related to high-heeled shoes, for example, or was it inspired by her? Did it coincide with it? Was there some sort of interrelationship there, do you think?
I actually don't think there was. I think there was more of a relationship, the early development of point work. In fact, the early development of point work depended on being able to get flat on your foot. In the 18th century, as you can see in one of the Camargo thing I showed, she's actually dancing on heels. And throughout the 18th century, the ballerinas danced in low heels, and it was only around the time of the French Revolution that they began adopting these kind of Grecian tunics again, which had become fashionable in society. I think of some of those, the dresses, Madame Recamier and others, and began wearing on stage for dancing at least some kind of sandals. And that meant that you could actually have your whole foot, and then you would stretch your foot. It enabled you to do a whole lot more. So what you do see in the 1830s there are shoes, the first point shoes, which are in fact like fashionable slippers, but then they were darned. The ones we saw, I'm pretty sure, were used for national dances or character dances. They would be then darned with this very thickly to strengthen the sides of the foot and then across the toe, so that they're with very strong feet, and which came about through the development of the technical development of certain kinds of exercises to strengthen the feet. You could actually go up momentarily on point. And it wasn't until they began putting blocks into something to stiffen the end of the toe and then also to really stiffen the sole, that you could start doing a whole number of other exercises. But that doesn't happen until after the 1860s. Okay.